Marcus Thompson had always believed that money could buy anything. At 35, he had built a successful tech company from scratch, and now enjoyed the kind of wealth that opened doors everywhere he went. His expensive suits, luxury cars, and exclusive memberships had taught him that the right amount of cash could solve any problem or grant any wish. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Marcus stood outside Buckingham Palace with his phone in hand, live streaming to his social media followers. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as tourists gathered around the famous red-coated guards standing at attention. Marcus had flown in from New York specifically for this moment, promising his online audience something they had never seen before. "Watch this. Everyone," Marcus whispered into his phone camera, his voice filled with confidence. "I'm about to show you what real influence looks like." His followers, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, began flooding the chat with excited messages and fire emojis. Marcus approached the nearest Queen's Guard, a tall soldier standing perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and black bearskin hat. The guard's face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained to do. Tourists nearby began to notice the well-dressed American with the expensive camera equipment, some pulling out their own phones to record what might happen next. The morning air was crisp, and the usual sounds of London traffic created a distant hum beyond the palace gates. Marcus straightened his tie and flashed his most charming smile at the camera before turning toward the guard. He had researched this moment for weeks, convinced that his approach would work where others had failed. "Excuse me, soldier," Marcus said loudly enough for his phone to pick up the audio clearly. The guard remained motionless, not even blinking in response. This was exactly what Marcus had expected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash, making sure the camera caught every detail of the crisp 100-pound notes. The crowd around them began to grow larger, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. A family from Germany stopped their morning walk to watch, while a group of college students from Australia moved closer with their phones ready to record. The atmosphere became charged with anticipation as more people realized what the American tourist was attempting to do. Marcus counted out 10 100-pound bills slowly and deliberately, holding them up to the camera. £1,000, he announced to his online audience. "Let's see if Her Majesty's Guard has a price." The live chat exploded with mixed reactions, some viewers cheering him on while others expressed disapproval at his disrespectful approach. He stepped closer to the guard, who continued to maintain his professional stance despite the growing crowd and obvious attempt to break his composure. The morning sun glinted off the guard's polished buttons and ceremonial sword, reminders of the centuries of tradition and honor that his uniform represented. "Listen, friend," Marcus said with the casual tone he used when closing business deals. "I'll give you £1,000 cash right here, right now, if you'll just give me a simple salute. One salute for my camera and this money is yours." He waved the bills in front of the guard's face, making sure every movement was captured for his live stream. The guard's expression never changed. His breathing remained steady, and his posture stayed perfectly rigid. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Though few tourists were bold enough to offer such a substantial bribe so publicly, Marcus waited for several seconds, expecting some kind of reaction or acknowledgement. When none came, he increased his offer with growing frustration. £1,500, he declared, pulling out more cash from his other pocket. "Come on, that's more than most people make in a month. All for one little salute." The crowd murmured among themselves in various languages, with some people shaking their heads in disapproval, while others watched with curious fascination. A security camera mounted on a nearby post captured every moment of the exchange, and palace security personnel had already been alerted to the situation developing. Outside the main gates, Marcus's confidence began to waver slightly as the guard continued to ignore his increasingly generous offers. This wasn't going according to his carefully planned script, and his online audience was starting to notice his growing desperation. Comments in the live chat began shifting from excitement to mockery as viewers realized the guard wasn't responding to the attempted bribery. The American businessman had built his entire identity around his ability to negotiate and influence others through financial incentives. His success in the corporate world had convinced him that everyone had a price, and that the right amount of money could overcome any obstacle or principle. Standing there with a handful of cash being ignored by a simple soldier, Marcus felt his worldview beginning to crack for the first time in years. The silence stretched on as Marcus stood there with his money extended toward the unmoving guard. His livestream audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers, drawn by the viral nature of what was unfolding. Comments poured in faster than he could read them, with viewers from around the world offering their opinions on his bold attempt to break centuries of military tradition. £2,000, Marcus announced desperately, his voice rising above the murmur of the growing crowd. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He had never encountered anyone who couldn't be swayed by money, and the guard's complete indifference was starting to unnerve him. A little girl tugged on her mother's coat sleeve, asking in a clear voice why the man was trying to give money to the soldier. Her innocent question carried across the courtyard, causing several adults to chuckle nervously. The child's mother quickly hushed her, but the damage was done. Marcus realized that his grand gesture was beginning to look foolish rather than impressive. The Queen's Guard, whose name was Sergeant James Mitchell, had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 8 years. He had stood watch during state visits, royal weddings, and countless tourist-filled days exactly like this one. His training had taught him to remain focused regardless of weather, noise, or distraction. He had seen everything from marriage proposals to protest attempts, but few people had ever been quite so persistent with such a large amount of cash. Behind his stoic exterior, Sergeant Mitchell was well aware of the Americans' increasingly frantic offers. He could hear every word, see every gesture in his peripheral vision, and sense the growing crowd gathering around them. However, his duty required him to remain completely still and silent, unless faced with a genuine security threat or emergency situation. Marcus pulled out his phone to check the live chat, hoping for encouragement from his followers. Instead, he found a mixed reaction that made his stomach sink. While some viewers were still cheering him on, others were calling him disrespectful and ignorant. Comments like "this is embarrassing" and "leave the guard alone" began appearing more frequently among the flood of responses. The morning tour groups had started to arrive at Buckingham Palace, and several guides were pointing toward the unusual scene playing out near the main entrance. A bus full of Japanese tourists pulled up at the nearby stop, and within minutes, dozens of additional phones were recording Marcus's failed attempt to corrupt one of Britain's most respected military traditions. "Look, I understand you have rules," Marcus said, trying a different approach. His business instincts told him to change tactics when one strategy wasn't working. "But surely those rules have exceptions for special circumstances. I'm offering you enough money to take a nice vacation with your family. Just one simple salute and we can both walk away happy." The guard's breathing remained steady and controlled, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the palace gates. His rifle stood perfectly positioned against his shoulder, and his feet remained planted in the exact spot where he had taken his post hours earlier. Every aspect of his appearance and posture spoke to years of disciplined training and unwavering commitment to duty. A group of American tourists recognized Marcus from his social media presence and began whispering excitedly among themselves. His fame as a successful entrepreneur had followed him across the Atlantic, but now that recognition was working against him as more people began filming his increasingly desperate behavior. Marcus decided to try appealing to what he assumed might be the guard's personal interests. "Listen, soldier, I know you probably don't make much money in the military. This cash could change your life. Pay off some debts, help your family, maybe put a down payment on a house. All I need is one small gesture for my audience." The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people, creating a semicircle around Marcus and the guard. Palace security officers were monitoring the situation from discreet positions, ready to intervene if the Americans' behavior escalated beyond mere verbal attempts at bribery. So far, he hadn't crossed any legal lines, but his persistence was beginning to draw official attention. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd shook his head disapprovingly and muttered something about "bloody tourists" to his wife. Their conversation was overheard by several nearby observers who nodded in agreement. The mood among the spectators was gradually shifting from amusement to irritation with Marcus's continued disrespect for the guard's position and duty. Marcus's confidence was crumbling as minutes passed without any response from the soldier. His entire adult life had been built around his ability to negotiate and influence others through financial incentives. He had closed million-dollar business deals, convinced investors to fund his projects, and built a social media empire by projecting an image of unstoppable success and influence. Standing there with thousands of pounds in cash being completely ignored by a simple soldier, Marcus began to realize that there might be things in this world that couldn't be bought or controlled through money alone. The thought was both humbling and terrifying for someone who had spent years believing that wealth was the ultimate solution to any problem or obstacle. The tension in the courtyard continued to build as Marcus raised his offer to £3,000. His voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there when he started his live stream an hour earlier. The crisp bills in his hand were beginning to wrinkle from his nervous grip, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool London morning. £3,000, he announced to both the guard and his online audience. That's more than some people make in 3 months. Just one salute, soldier. One simple gesture, and this money is yours. His voice echoed off the palace walls, drawing even more attention from passing tourists and local residents who had stopped to witness the unusual spectacle. Sergeant Mitchell had been standing in the same position for nearly 2 hours now, long before the American businessman had arrived with his camera and cash. His legs showed no signs of fatigue. His posture remained perfectly erect and his breathing stayed controlled and steady. 8 years of military service had taught him that duty came before personal comfort, financial temptation, or public pressure. The crowd surrounding them had grown to include people from dozens of different countries. A family from Italy stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones about the disrespectful American. A group of French students filmed everything on their phones, already planning to share the videos with their friends back home. The international nature of the audience meant that Marcus's behavior was being broadcast and discussed in multiple languages simultaneously. A young British woman in the crowd finally spoke up loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's not going to break, mate. You're wasting your time and embarrassing yourself." Her comment drew murmurs of agreement from several other observers, and Marcus felt his cheeks flush with a combination of anger and humiliation. Marcus turned toward the woman with his trademark business smile, the same expression he used when trying to close difficult deals. "Everyone has a price, darling. I just haven't found his yet." He pulled out his phone to check his bank balance, making a show of the action for his live stream audience. "Maybe I need to think bigger." The comment about thinking bigger sent a chill through the crowd as people realized the American might be preparing to escalate his offer even further. Several onlookers began shaking their heads and walking away, disgusted by what they saw as a crude attempt to corrupt one of Britain's most cherished traditions. Sergeant Mitchell's mind wandered briefly to his family back home in Yorkshire. His wife Sarah would be getting their 2 young children ready for school right about now, probably listening to the morning news while making breakfast. She was proud of his service with the Queen's Guard, often telling friends and neighbors about his role protecting the royal family and representing British military tradition. The thought of his family strengthened the guard's resolve, reminding him of why he had chosen to serve his country in the first place. The money being offered by the desperate American could indeed help with their mortgage or their children's education, but accepting it would mean betraying everything he had sworn to protect and uphold. Marcus's livestream chat had become increasingly critical as viewers from around the world weighed in on his behavior. Comments like, "This is so disrespectful," and "Leave the poor guard alone," were appearing faster than positive responses. His follower count was actually increasing due to the viral nature of the stream, but the engagement was becoming overwhelmingly negative. A tour guide with a group of elderly visitors approached the edge of the crowd, curious about what was causing such a commotion. When she realized what was happening, she quickly ushered her group away from the scene, explaining in a loud voice that they shouldn't encourage this type of disrespectful behavior toward the Queen's Guard. The guide's comments were picked up by Marcus's phone microphone, adding another layer of public disapproval to his already struggling attempt. He was beginning to realize that his grand gesture was backfiring spectacularly, but his pride prevented him from simply walking away and admitting defeat. £4,000, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking slightly with strain. £4,000 for one salute. That's more money than most people see in cash in their entire lives. He held the bills high above his head, making sure every camera in the crowd could capture the dramatic gesture. The guard's eyes never moved from their fixed position. His breathing never quickened and his stance never wavered. He had been trained to ignore distractions, threats, and temptations of all kinds. The American businessman with his handful, of cash was simply another test of his professional discipline and personal integrity. A group of local London residents who had been watching from across the street finally decided to intervene. They approached the crowd with expressions of obvious displeasure, preparing to voice their objections to Marcus's continued harassment of the soldier. The situation was about to take a dramatic turn as the community began to rally around their guard. A distinguished-looking gentleman in his 70s broke through the crowd, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. Colonel William Hartwell had served with the Coldstream Guards 40 years earlier and couldn't stand to watch the Americans' continued disrespect for the institution he had once proudly served. "Young man," the colonel said firmly, positioning himself between Marcus and the guard, "what you're doing here is not just inappropriate. It's insulting to every person who has ever worn that uniform." His voice carried the authority of decades of military leadership, and the crowd immediately quieted to hear his words. Marcus looked annoyed at the interruption, his livestream audience now exceeding 70,000 viewers as word of the confrontation spread across social media platforms. "Look, grandfather, this is between me and the soldier. I'm making him a legitimate business offer that could change his life." The colonel's face darkened at the dismissive tone and disrespectful address. "That soldier has dedicated his life to serving something greater than money, something you clearly don't understand. His duty isn't for sale, and your behavior is a disgrace to every tourist who visits this country." Several people in the crowd began applauding the colonel's words, creating a wave of support that rippled through the gathered observers. A woman shouted, "Well said," from the back of the group, while others nodded approvingly at the elderly veteran's intervention. Marcus felt his control of the situation slipping away as public opinion turned decisively against him. His business instincts told him to retreat and regroup, but his pride and the presence of his massive online audience prevented him from admitting defeat. £5,000, he announced desperately, pulling out his entire travel cash supply. The escalation to £5,000 caused several people in the crowd to gasp audibly. It was an enormous sum to offer for such a simple gesture, but rather than impressing the observers, it only made Marcus look more desperate and foolish. The colonel shook his head sadly, as if watching a man destroy his own reputation in real time. Sergeant Mitchell had heard every word of the exchange between the American and the elderly veteran. The support from the colonel and the crowd reminded him that he wasn't standing alone, that his duty represented something valued and protected by the entire community. His resolve strengthened even further as he continued his silent vigil. A young mother with 2 small children approached the colonel and asked if she should call the police about the harassment. Her question was overheard by several other observers, who began discussing whether Marcus's behavior had crossed legal boundaries. The threat of official intervention added a new dimension of pressure to an already tense situation. Marcus's phone buzzed with notifications as news outlets began picking up the live stream and sharing clips on their social media accounts. What had started as a simple attempt to impress his followers was rapidly becoming an international incident that would follow him for years to come. "Listen, all of you," Marcus said, addressing the crowd while keeping his phone camera rolling. "I'm not trying to insult anyone. I'm simply demonstrating that in a free market economy, everything has a price. Even honor, even duty, even tradition. This guard is just another employee, and employees respond to financial incentives." The colonel stepped closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every person in the courtyard. "Son, you've just revealed everything that's wrong with your worldview. That guard isn't an employee. He's a guardian of something precious that your money can't touch, can't buy, and can't corrupt." A teenage boy in the crowd started a slow clap that was gradually joined by others, creating a rhythmic sound of approval for the colonel's words. The applause grew louder and more sustained, drowning out Marcus's attempts to continue his offer to the still motionless guard. Marcus realized that his livestream had become a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Comments were flooding in from viewers who had screen-recorded his failed attempts and were already sharing them across other platforms. His business reputation, carefully built over years of success, was crumbling in real time as millions of people watched him fail to understand basic concepts of honor and duty. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the palace courtyard. Other guards at their posts around the building remained equally motionless, demonstrating that Sergeant Mitchell's behavior wasn't exceptional, but rather the standard expected of every soldier who wore the uniform. A group of American tourists approached the edge of the crowd, initially excited to see a fellow countryman creating such a scene. However, as they realized what Marcus was attempting to do, their expressions changed from curiosity to embarrassment. One woman was overheard telling her husband that Marcus was making all Americans look bad with his behavior. The weight of international disapproval was beginning to crush Marcus's confidence completely. His grand gesture had backfired in every possible way, turning him from a successful entrepreneur into a global symbol of arrogance and cultural insensitivity. The guard continued to stand perfectly still, unmoved by money, pressure, or the chaos swirling around him. Palace security officers finally decided to intervene as the crowd grew larger, and the situation became increasingly volatile. Two uniformed guards approached the scene, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere from curious entertainment to serious official business. The lead officer, Inspector Davies, had been monitoring the situation from inside the palace gates for the past 30 minutes. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the guard and disperse this gathering," Inspector Davies said firmly to Marcus, his hand resting casually on his radio. "You're creating a public disturbance and potentially interfering with official duties." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest as he realized the legal implications of his actions. His live stream audience had grown to over 100,000, viewers many of whom were now watching a successful American businessman potentially getting arrested on foreign soil. "Officer, I haven't broken any laws. I'm simply having a conversation and making a business proposition." Inspector Davies glanced at the thick stack of cash still clutched in Marcus's hand, then looked directly into the camera phone that was recording everything. "Attempting to bribe a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces could be considered a serious offense, sir. I suggest you put that money away and move along before this situation escalates further." The crowd murmured approvingly at the officer's intervention, many people expressing relief that someone in authority was finally addressing Marcus's inappropriate behavior. The colonel who had spoken earlier stepped forward to offer his support to the security team, identifying himself as a former Coldstream Guards officer. Marcus's business mind raced as he tried to find a way out of the situation that wouldn't completely destroy his reputation. His livestream comments were now dominated by viewers calling for him to apologize and leave the guard alone. Even his most loyal followers were beginning to turn against him as the international backlash intensified. "Perhaps we can reach some kind of arrangement," Marcus said to Inspector Davies, his voice taking on the desperate tone of a cornered negotiator. "I'm a successful businessman with significant resources. Surely there's a way to resolve this situation that benefits everyone involved." The inspector's expression hardened at what sounded like an attempt to bribe a police officer in addition to the guard. "Sir, you need to understand that your money means nothing here. These men serve something greater than personal profit, and your continued offers are only making this situation worse for yourself." Sergeant Mitchell remained perfectly still throughout the entire exchange, his discipline unshaken by the chaos surrounding his post. His breathing stayed controlled, his posture remained erect, and his eyes continued to focus on the distant horizon beyond the palace gates. The presence of security officers and the growing crowd had no effect on his professional demeanor whatsoever. A news crew from a local London television station arrived on the scene, having been alerted by social media posts about the American tourist causing a disturbance at Buckingham Palace. The reporter immediately began filming, recognizing the potential for a story that would resonate with viewers around the world. Marcus noticed the professional camera equipment and felt a moment of hope that media attention might somehow validate his actions. "This is perfect timing," he said to the news crew. "You're witnessing a fascinating social experiment about the true nature of honor and duty in the modern world." The reporter, however, had already spoken with several witnesses in the crowd and understood the true nature of what had been happening. Her questions to Marcus were pointed and skeptical, focusing on why he thought it was appropriate to attempt to corrupt a soldier performing his official duties. "I'm demonstrating that everyone has a price," Marcus replied, still trying to maintain his original narrative despite the obvious failure of his experiment. "It's simply a matter of finding the right number. This guard is just being stubborn. But eventually, Practical considerations will override his training. The reporter's follow-up questions became increasingly challenging as she pressed Marcus on the ethical implications of his actions. Her live broadcast was being picked up by international news networks, spreading the story far beyond London, and ensuring that Marcus's behavior would be scrutinized by millions of people worldwide. Inspector Davies decided that the situation had gone on long enough and needed to be resolved before it attracted even more attention or escalated into something more serious. "Sir, you have two choices," he told Marcus firmly. "You can leave voluntarily right now, or I can arrest you for public disturbance and attempted bribery of a government official." The ultimatum sent shockwaves through Marcus's livestream audience as viewers realized they might be about to witness an arrest. Comments flooded in with advice ranging from, "Just leave," to, "This is so embarrassing for Americans." His follower count continued to climb, but for all the wrong reasons. Marcus looked around at the crowd of disapproving faces, the professional news cameras, the stern security officers, and the completely unmoved guard who had started this entire debacle. For the first time in years, he found himself in a situation where his money, influence, and negotiating skills were completely powerless to help him. The reality of his complete failure was finally beginning to sink in as Marcus realized that he had misunderstood something fundamental about human nature and the values that some people hold above material wealth. Marcus stood frozen in the courtyard, surrounded by hostile faces and recording devices, as the full weight of his situation finally hit him. His hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the £5,000 in cash that had proven completely worthless against one soldier's unwavering integrity. The money that had always been his solution to every problem now felt like evidence of his profound miscalculation. "I want to make one final offer," Marcus said desperately, his voice cracking with emotion. He raised the cash above his head again, but this time his gesture looked pathetic rather than confident. £10,000! That's £10,000 for one simple salute! His live stream audience watched in horrified fascination as a successful businessman completely self-destructed in real time. Inspector Davies had heard enough and stepped forward with official authority. "That's it, sir. You're under arrest for attempted bribery of a public official and creating a public disturbance." The officer's words rang out clearly across the courtyard, causing a ripple of excitement and concern to pass through the gathered crowd. The news reporter immediately moved closer to capture every moment of the arrest, her camera operator positioning himself for the best angle. This was exactly the kind of dramatic conclusion that would make the story memorable and shareable across international news networks. Marcus felt his world collapsing as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His phone, still live streaming to over 150,000 viewers, clattered to the ground and continued recording the scene from an awkward angle on the pavement. Comments flooded the screen faster than anyone could read them, with viewers expressing everything from shock to satisfaction at seeing the arrogant American finally face consequences. Throughout the entire arrest process, Sergeant Mitchell never moved from his position or acknowledged what was happening just a few feet away from him. His training and dedication had been tested by one of the most persistent and well-funded attempts at corruption anyone could remember, and he had passed without even blinking. The colonel who had confronted Marcus earlier approached the fallen phone and spoke directly to the camera. "Let this be a lesson to everyone watching around the world. Some things cannot be bought, some people cannot be corrupted, and some values are worth more than any amount of money. That young man in uniform represents the best of what humanity can achieve when we put duty before personal gain." As Marcus was led away toward a police vehicle, he could hear the crowd erupting in spontaneous applause for the guard who had remained steadfast throughout the entire ordeal. The sound of clapping echoed off the palace walls, creating a powerful moment of unity among people from dozens of different countries who had witnessed something truly remarkable. The arrest video began spreading across social media platforms within minutes, with clips being shared, commented on, and analyzed by millions of users worldwide. News outlets picked up the story immediately, recognizing its appeal as a modern parable about wealth, integrity, and the limits of financial influence. Marcus's business empire, built on his image as an unstoppable negotiator and deal-maker, began crumbling as investors and partners distanced themselves from the scandal. His social media accounts were flooded with negative comments. His company's stock price started falling, and potential business deals were quietly canceled as corporations avoided association with his behavior. In the police station, Marcus sat in a holding cell and reflected on how drastically his life had changed in just a few hours. The £10,000 that he had been so confident would break the guards' resolve now seemed like a pathetic amount. Compared to the millions of dollars his reputation would cost him, his phone, eventually retrieved from the courtyard, contained hundreds of missed calls and thousands of messages from business associates, family members, and journalists seeking comment on the viral video. The story had already been picked up by major news networks in America, Europe, and Asia, making Marcus an unwitting symbol of American arrogance abroad. Back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Mitchell completed his shift exactly as scheduled, maintaining his professional demeanor until the moment he was officially relieved by the next guard. As he walked back to the barracks, several tourists and security officers nodded respectfully, acknowledging his exemplary performance under extraordinary pressure. The guard's commanding officer later commended him privately for upholding the highest standards of military bearing and personal integrity. The incident would become part of training discussions for future guards, serving as an example of how to handle unusual situations while maintaining professional composure. News interviews with Colonel Hartwell and other witnesses painted a clear picture of what had transpired, with most observers praising the guards' unshakable dedication to duty. The story resonated particularly strongly with military families and veterans who understood the deeper meaning behind the soldier's refusal to compromise his principles for money. Marcus's failed attempt had inadvertently created one of the most powerful demonstrations of military honor and personal integrity ever captured on video, providing the world with a reminder that some values cannot be purchased at any price. 6 months after the incident, Marcus Thompson sat in his significantly smaller apartment in New York, scrolling through the comments on what had become one of the most viral videos in internet history. The clip of his arrest at Buckingham Palace had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, spawning countless memes, reaction videos, and discussion threads about wealth, privilege, and moral integrity. His tech company had collapsed within weeks of the scandal, as investors pulled funding and clients canceled contracts. The board of directors had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, citing the reputational damage his behavior had caused to the brand. Marcus had been forced to sell his luxury cars, expensive watches, and downtown penthouse to cover his legal fees and mounting debts. The criminal charges in London had resulted in a substantial fine and a lifetime ban from entering any British royal properties. More damaging than the legal consequences, however, was the complete destruction of his business reputation and social media influence. His follower count had actually increased to over 2 million people, but they followed him now as a cautionary tale rather than as an inspiration. Marcus had spent months in therapy, trying to understand how his obsession with wealth and control had led him to make such a catastrophic error in judgment. His therapist helped him recognize that his attempt to bribe the guard had been less about proving a point and more about validating his own worldview that money was the ultimate source of power and influence. The video of Sergeant Mitchell standing unmoved while Marcus desperately waved cash at him had become a symbol of integrity, triumphing over corruption. The guard himself had never given any interviews or made any public statements about the incident, maintaining his characteristic professionalism and dedication to duty. Even as he became internationally famous, educational institutions around the world began using the footage in ethics classes and leadership seminars, presenting it as a perfect example of how personal principles can withstand external pressure. Military academies incorporated the incident into their training materials, highlighting the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of circumstances. Marcus received hundreds of letters from people around the world, most of them expressing disappointment in his behavior, but some offering forgiveness and encouragement for his future rehabilitation. The letters that affected him most deeply came from military families, who explained how his actions had insulted their loved ones' service and sacrifice. One particularly moving letter came from Sergeant Mitchell's wife, Sarah, who wrote to explain how proud she was of her husband's behavior during the incident. She described how their children had watched the video and learned important lessons about standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to compromise. Her words helped Marcus understand the broader impact of his actions on real families and communities. The former businessman had started working at a nonprofit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian careers, accepting a salary that was a tiny fraction of what he had once earned. The work was humbling but meaningful, allowing him to contribute something positive to society while learning about the values and experiences of people who had dedicated their lives to service rather than profit. Marcus often thought about the Guard during quiet moments, wondering what might have motivated such unwavering dedication to duty. He had come to understand that Sergeant Mitchell's refusal wasn't about rejecting money specifically, but about protecting something more valuable than any financial reward could represent. The incident had taught Marcus that true strength came not from the ability to buy influence or control others, but from the capacity to remain true to one's principles even under intense pressure. The Guard had demonstrated a form of power that Marcus's wealth had never been able to purchase or understand. In his new role at the Veterans Organization, Marcus met dozens of former soldiers who shared similar stories of choosing duty over personal gain. These conversations helped him appreciate the deeper meaning behind military service and the sacrifices that people like Sergeant Mitchell made every day to protect values larger than themselves. The viral video continued to circulate on social media, often appearing during discussions about ethics, integrity, and the limits of financial influence. Marcus had stopped reading the comments months ago, but he knew that his failed attempt to corrupt the Queen's Guard would follow him for the rest of his life as a reminder of his former arrogance and the hard-learned lessons that followed. Sergeant Mitchell continued his service with the Coldstream Guards, still standing watch at royal properties and ceremonies with the same dedication and professionalism he had always displayed. The incident at Buckingham Palace had become part of his service record, but he never spoke about it publicly, maintaining the same quiet dignity that had made him a symbol of integrity around the world. The Guard's commanding officers had received commendations from the highest levels of government, praising the entire unit for upholding the finest traditions of British military service. The incident had actually strengthened public support for the Queen's Guard, with donations pouring in to support military charities and veteran organizations across the United Kingdom. Marcus's story had become a modern parable, retold in business schools as an example of how unchecked privilege and arrogance could lead to spectacular downfall. The case study was titled "The Price of Everything, The Value of Nothing," examining how his fundamental misunderstanding of human motivation had destroyed a multi-million-dollar empire in a single morning. Years later, when Marcus finally achieved some measure of peace with his new life, he would sometimes watch the video of that morning at Buckingham Palace. He could see clearly now what he had been blind to then, that Sergeant Mitchell hadn't been rejecting his money, but protecting something infinitely more valuable than cash could ever represent. The Guard had taught the world that some things truly cannot be bought, that integrity has no price tag, and that the strength to stand unmoved in the face of temptation is worth more than all the wealth in the world. In trying to prove that everyone had a price, Marcus had instead demonstrated that the most important things in life are absolutely priceless. The incident served as a powerful reminder that in a world increasingly dominated by material concerns, there still existed people willing to stand guard over principles that no amount of money could corrupt. Sergeant Mitchell's silent vigil had spoken louder than any words, proving that true honor cannot be purchased, only earned through years of dedicated service and unwavering commitment to something greater than oneself. The story continues to inspire people around the world, a testament to the enduring power of duty, honor, and integrity in an age when such values are often considered outdated or naive. The Queen's Guard had won a victory not just for himself, but for everyone who believes that some things in life are worth more than money, and that the human spirit cannot always be bought at any price.